Welcome to the six-part series with Carmen Madina. Carmen is a former CIA Deputy Intelligence Director, author, and consultant. Carmen is a thinker and hopes to popularize better thinking. We both feel that philosophy and thinking better are an ideal pairing, and we hope you enjoy this fun, natural conversation. I always figure that I'm fairly fortunate in Canada with the climate that we have, because the Pacific Coast has fairly warm winds that come off. It's probably the most mild portion of the climate across Canada, and but the climate is changing. We have a lot of forest fires in the summer and stuff like that. So,
well, actually, I have very good friends who are in Oregon, and we just finished getting a beach house for the last full week in August in Manzanita. I don't know, you probably have heard of Cannon Beach.
Okay.
Which is the quite well-known resort there, or not resort, beach town. And then just below it is a smaller, quainter town called Manzanita, which means little apple in Spanish.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And I remember when I was telling my friend Ginny that I had driven, my friend in Oregon, Ginny, that I had driven through this town that looked really cute. Just shows you how bilingual I am. I remembered it as Apple. There's a little town called Apple on the she goes, Apple. And finally we figured out that my brain just, without any fuss, just went, oh, it's called Apple.
Yeah, it's what maps on to our cognition, and that might be a perfect segue into the analytic landscapes that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
But it's a heuristic, right? So it's a little memory device that sits kind of subconsciously below the radar there, and Apple is what fell from the tree, wasn't it, so to speak?
I remember a recent article I read, I think it was in the New Yorker, about what a thought is. What is a thought? I'm not sure if I mentioned this last time, but it was either in that article or some other article where they talked about how your brain works. And one of the things your brain does is it categorizes things. It puts like with like as part of its knowledge structure. And so often when and this is, with my age now, I'm particularly sensitive to this. When I forget, I will go, I need to do X. And then 5 seconds later, and I head off to do X, and then I completely forget what X was. And the article says that what happens is your brain, for example, will associate ideas with different rooms in your house. So I'll be in my dining room. My brain will remind me, oh, X. Then I walk from my dining room into the kitchen. The brain goes, oh, it's kitchen now. And that's like washes out the other stuff. So it was some small consolation that it wasn't necessarily a sign of impending doom with old age, but kind of the natural process that the brain uses to make sense of the world.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Carmen. I spend a lot of time thinking about memory, and I've been somebody that I think has been plagued with a poor memory my entire life. To bring a cameo from my mother into the conversation. Yeah. I mean, we had a downstairs area for it wasn't quite a cellar, but it was a downstairs where we kept a bucket of potatoes, right? And so mom would cook, be cooking dinner, and she would give me the sieve to go downstairs and get enough potatoes so that she could cook it for the meal. Every mom needs a little bit of help, and that was kind of my role from time to time. So there she would give me the sieve, and I'd march downstairs, and I'd be off in daydream land thinking about, God only knows. And I'd come up 5 minutes later and I said, what did you want? Right. Like, it's the easiest of instructions. Go downstairs, get me the potatoes.
Right.
And so she has this famous line that I always remember. Speaking of heuristics, she says, I think somewhat in a loving way, right? But it was, you'll hear the undertones of frustration in this. She's like, if you had a clue, you'd play with it. And so I've embraced that. I think it's, remember in our last episode, you talked about like an intentional laziness, but it was
right. A strategic laziness.
Strategic laziness.
It's this wonderful phrase somebody used, which I really enjoyed.
And I think you can appreciate that there's different kinds of thinkers without trying to defend one kind of
course,
thinking
right.
over another. I think that we naturally function, and way we function in groups is that we do think differently. So this is what binds us in groups. This is what allows us a dynamic sorting categorization function, which you alluded to, right? About this function of categorizing. So if I was going to bring that into the concepts of the landscape, the cognitive landscapes, what do you see? There's a connection there, or would you?
Oh no, absolutely, there is a connection there. I mean, any landscape has to have at least an X and a Y axis, right? It's either associated with reality because it's like geographical, north, south, east, and west. But more likely, if we're talking about an issue, it's associated with, some categories that you can lump everything, cluster everything else around. I don't know if you ever did 2x2 quadrants, which are very popular with people coming up with future scenarios. And the process, but which I grew to dislike because I thought it oversimplified everything. Mm-hmm. So the process is you start off and you're talking about, let's say, the future of globalization. I believe I did this one. I participated in one on this. And you throw out in a post-it note storm, you write every variable that you can think of that could have something to do with the future of globalization. And then you start clustering them like with like. And then you eventually, so that you can do a 2x2 quadrant, come up with two variables that you can have less of or more of. So I think in the globalization, it might have been less equal, more equal. Equality might have been one of the axis lines. And then another one might have been, US led or Chinese led. Let's say that's, and then you take all the other variables and try to cluster them around those 4 points. And now I think when I did these were all paper-based exercises, but now with computer graphics, you could create 3D variables, right? With a depth variable as well. And the reason why so it's a categorization system right there to create a landscape. Mm-hmm. The reason why I grew to dislike them is, or to be dissatisfied with them, is that they tended to, so when you were in the first couple of hours of this, did you ever do this?
No, but I understand, and I had something very similar, and I'm absolutely captivated, and
when
I completely agree with you at the beginning that it has its limits and utility.
Yeah,
but
right.
Please do. This is
but when you started, the first hour and a half was when you were doing that brainstorming on all the variables. And I thought that was really rich. You'd have the entire wall of a conference room full of 200-300 Post-it notes. And then you would take those Post-it notes and you would reduce them, as I said, to come up with the two variables. And inevitably, there were several Post-it notes that were exotic, eccentric, fascinating, that just got thrown to the cutting room floor because they didn't fit. They didn't fit the categorization scheme. And every time I did these, I thought, this judgment that we're making that this isn't relevant to the future of globalization just because it doesn't fit our two arbitrarily chosen categories is not a good heuristic. This is not a good process. So yes, an analytic landscape can't exist without categories. And although kind of arranging it in a 2x2 quadrant is artificial because China is not a 2x2 quadrant. There's no country there's nothing that's a 2x2 quadrant. Mm-hmm. if you're honest about it, it is a good way to check your thinking. And what I mean by if you're honest about it, as things happen, let's say you develop this analytic landscape year one. How I thought it could be used as a diagnostic device and a check on your thinking is that every year you would, or whatever interval you chose, you would do a content analysis of all the content that you could vacuum up on China. So let's say you just sucked up the entire internet, China, and then you did a meta-analysis and you had the AI throw out the tags the words that appear most frequently. And then what you should do is check that list of tags or categories that appear frequently in the content against your landscape. And just ask yourself, do all those words fit naturally, without forcing the issue into my landscape? If so, then I believe I can say that my landscape has not expired. It still seems to be relevant for the year. But I could easily imagine a scenario 5 years later, or a situation 5 years later, where you again did an analysis of all the content on China, and all of a sudden you got frequent words that didn't fit your landscape anymore. You couldn't account for them in your landscape. And I think that's happening right now. I'll give you an example. If you imagine somebody had that landscape on China and they developed it 5 years ago, I'm pretty sure that they did not have the phrase Metoo Movement in that landscape, right? And I would be pretty sure they did not have banning of tattoos in that landscape. And yet both of those things have occurred in China, the scandal with the tennis star and the decision to forbid the national football team from wearing tattoos. And so as an analyst, if I were still an active analyst, I would go, okay, I don't really account for this kind of stuff happening in my scenario. And I might have to rethink my categorization scheme.
That's brilliant. And I think from an analyst standpoint, there's a fairly intuitive and natural way to receive those, we'll just call them headlines.
Yes.
Right. Because
yes,
that's
right.
what you're watching. You're watching, what comes through in terms of, that the culture, what's happening, from, it could be news, headlines or, this type of thing. Right.
Right.
So I think that's quite brilliant. Where my mind went in terms of the 2x2.
Yes.
Is what do you think of the matrix expanding to say, like, what happens when the matrix forms a 3x3, a 4x4, a 5x5, a 6x6, and a 7x7?
Well, I think what happens is it becomes difficult for people to write. See, I think one of the things that is a limiting factor in how people have constructed scenarios about the future is that they were presented through the use of language.
Yeah.
And I find when you write, the whole sort of driving energy principle behind good writing is to simplify. And one of the things that, I've been an editor essentially most of my professional life because I would edit other analysts' work. And one of my rules of thumb is that you only get to say something once. So you have to find the optimum place to make that point in your argument. Because when you're dealing with very busy people, executives, if they get the feeling I already read this, they will stop reading. And so you have to be very clever, I would say artificial, about how you present your prose. And so when you think about a 5 square, whatever that word would be, not a quadrant, but a 5 square thing, or a 10 square thing, then you have to think about how could you write that out in such a way that the reader would follow you, stay on track with you, but you're also still conveying the nuance and complexity of what you're doing. And that I think is quite difficult. And so there are visual approaches, graphical approaches to presenting such information. I kind of think virtual reality or augmented reality might have a role to play here. Imagine a scenario, a space that you're in. I'm trying to avoid using the word scenario too often. Imagine if you're in a space, and that space is actually an instantiation of how you see the future of China, and the policymaker wearing the headset could walk through that space. And one of the things that he or she might experience is that if she changed her position just slightly, she might end up in a dramatically different scenario. So that this experience could convey the nonlinearity of it all, and it could also convey how closely connected they all are. So that just a little step this way or a little change that way could create a big difference.
I want to take it two ways. I want to take it to the practical approach. I want to take it to other policymakers that are in China. The abstract direction that I want to take it is that I want to say, recently on LinkedIn, you posted that you liked an article by somebody that was talking about cognitive bias. And I would say this is your alarm bell, right? So the biases are focused around storytelling.
Yes, I really enjoyed that piece. And like you, I've now bookmarked him. I have lists of sources that I go to on a regular basis, an ever expanding list. I just felt what I really wanted to do is read his blog from beginning to end, because he talked about how much his views on the world have changed since he's been doing this. And I really wanted some insight into that.
That's very interesting. I think you have to look to see where the transitions and the anomalies are. So now how about we go back even further to that room where all the sticky notes are, and we look at the outliers, we look at the anomalies, and the decision to throw them out or exclude them. That's very fascinating. That assumption may or may not get us in trouble. Why do I say trouble? Well, a lot of the shifts that come from thinking actually come from that contrarian standpoint. When someone brings in something new, that's what replicates. That's what brings in something new. And when I look at the 2x2 simplistic grid, I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of returning to a structure that is already in play from storytelling, the structure itself, where the foundation of storytelling is in the dialect itself. Now, we can move away from the stories, but can we move away from the stories and the ways we tell the stories when we stay in a 2x2 framework? Now, you had mentioned that we have to tell the story in a way that the story is transferable so that the reader or listener actually digests the information. But are we, in doing that, by staying in that system, are we staying within a storytelling structure, even if we do transcend stepping above, like we step above the antiquated stories? We're still using the foundations.
I agree with you. And I think that's a good point. That's one of the problems with writing and reading in general, is that they are inescapably linear activities, except for some poetry, but that's a different animal. But when you try to write so that you share your views effectively with another person, just the way the English language is constructed makes it almost impossible to escape linearity. And linearity is just it's like a form of narrative. A story is supposed to have energy. It's supposed to go from A to B to C and eventually end. And so you're right.
Do you put some of these systems together? You're involved with a consulting company. Are you putting systems together and building on anything that is a platform or a system? Are you doing anything like that actively?
I always wanted to work with these ideas more, but at least in the context of the intelligence community and national security, these are kind of perhaps nice to have, definitely fringe ideas, at best, nice to haves. I remember once when I was in charge of a team, I said rather innocently, I said, this wall of 200 Post-it notes, what I would like to see is I called it a scenario generation machine that could somehow take those 200 Post-it notes and combine them in all possible permutations that were logical. So there had to be some kind of or several algorithms, many algorithms that kind of made assumptions about what happens in the world. And then I'd like to see a plot of all those possible scenarios. And then I'd like to see, okay, what are the scenarios that, and then they're grouped by similarity and differences so that I could see, okay, these are, and 80%, it's like a bell curve. In 80% of the cases, the scenarios look more or less like this. And then there's the 10% on the left and the 10% on the right. I just thought that would be a fantastic thing. Well, little did I know, since I was the boss, somebody went off and decided to try to do it and actually let out a contract. And I was like, oh, geez, I got to be careful about what I say because this was 20 years ago. I think my idea was a bit premature in terms of what computer science and AI could do. But even as I just described it to you, I thought, I think that would be a fantastic, I still think that's a fantastic, useful thing to do. And I think that technology is a lot closer now to do it.
I do too. I think especially the work that's happening in complex systems, say, for example, out of the Santa Fe Institute's doing some brilliant work there. I lean towards a 7x7 grid, and I'll tell you why.
Oh, okay.
As a maximum, I don't think we have intuitively. I don't think we have the capability to process that a 7x7. So I think there's some without getting Freudian on you. There's some subconscious things that are affecting us. But I like the seven. I like the model as a starting point of the 7x7 grid for the following reason. When you look at trying to combine numbers, and this happens in natural language acquisition, the number 7 is something that we can naturally look at 7 dots on a page and look at it and say that it's 7, right?
Okay, so we can actually absorb it without counting.
Exactly. And so and anything above 7 is combinatorial, right?
Yeah.
Then you do 4 and 4, right?
Right.
And then 9 is 4 and 5. So this is just a guess, right? But the foundation for it has some there's some research around that, some substantial research around the fact of what we can actually see in terms of combinatorial sort of thinking. And the number 7 is that maximum, right?
I didn't know that. That's really interesting. And you're reminding me of something. I read this book called 137 once. It's a book about Carl Jung.
I have to say a joke. Was this on Amazon Prime? Anyway, sorry. It was too irresistible.
It's too good. I agree. But it was about Carl Jung, this Nobel Prize winning physicist Pauli, and the pursuit of a scientific obsession. The long and short of it is that Pauli, the physicist, consulted with Jung about his dreams. And I think the thing that he's known for is identifying some kind of constant in the universe, some number that's like a constant that helps explain a lot of stuff. I mean, I read a lot about cosmology and physics, but my actual grasp of the details is like limited. And Jung helped interpret his dreams, Pauli's dreams, in such a way that he figured it out. And part of the fascination, this gets to the number 7, is that Jung believed there were just certain numbers in the universe, in life, that were very important numbers. And so 137. So, one God, the Trinity, 3. I forget exactly why 7 is there. His reason for 7 being there, but I don't know. That's the name of the book, 137. So, mathematics, of which I am horrible at. I mean, there must be a word even worse than horrible, of which for which I have just no talent apparently whatsoever. Mathematics is just so interesting because of this idea that there are inherent rules, unbreakable inherent rules. Like, there's an infinite prime numbers.
Oh, the infinite one. Let's go there in a second. But I think what I'm feeling from you here is that, listeners might kind of scratch their heads and say, how did you get to such an influential position as an analyst? and not. But I think number one, first of all, you have a real respect for mathematics. Okay. Number two, I think you're such a big picture thinking woman that you have the ability to understand when the importance and the significance emerges.
Right.
That big picture thinking, regardless of whether or not you're the one actually doing the equations. And so I can relate to that. Yeah. Okay, well, that's interesting. Why don't we talk about China now?
Okay, you want to talk about China?
Yeah, and the reason I think the entry point into China would be something like this, that with everything that's led up to the discussion at this point, okay, if you were, what would somebody involved with policy in China, in the government, say about how we're structuring this? Is there systematic failures or things that they would completely on its surface, on its face, disagree with in terms of what we're doing, in terms of categorizing things like this?
In terms of how the West views China, is that the question?
No, but say, for example, you were hired as a consultant to go in and talk to the policymakers in China. And once the appropriate people in the room helped, figure out the language barriers and such, the information that you're conveying that we've just been talking about, would it be received?
I see. Would they
say this is something that is universal, or this is really foreign? I mean, mathematics, right? See, mathematics is a universal language.
Right.
So how far away from that baseline of a universal language of mathematics would the ideas that you're putting forward, and we can return to that 2x2 structure, which we've already said is insufficient and not complete. But how would it be viewed differently in terms of a room of people in a delegation of Chinese?
Yeah, you're asking. It's a very interesting question. So. Luckily, just last night, I read, there's this consultant, I guess he is, Dan Wang, W-A-N-G. And he has, for the last 5 years or so, been writing a letter, an end-of-the-year letter on China. And I discovered it 2 years ago, maybe. And it must be 25,000 words. I mean, it takes a full hour to read it, just once. And it's quite rich and thick. And highly nuanced. He lives in Shanghai. I get the impression he speaks Chinese fluently, but he's also very Western, very American. And I'm not going to answer your question directly, but maybe we'll be able to circle back. So when I read his letters, he makes a very strong case that unlike the US and most of the West, China is a highly planned activity. So you might even think of it as highly mathematical. And a strength of that is that they, to the best of their ability, anticipate the consequences of what they're doing and then make specific plans. Like this past year, 2021, was the year that they were going to try to rein in financial speculation because it had gotten out of hand. And so as far as this Dan Wang is concerned, and his view is not a minority view, what the Chinese don't do things by accident. They do things, whether their calculations are right or wrong, they do things based on their calculations. And one of their calculations, I think, is that, and I don't know what you would call these things mathematically, but I mentioned tattoos and I mentioned the Metoo movement. Those two things are irrelevant. They're not irrelevant in that the Chinese haven't thought about them, because I think the Chinese understand that there's only so much conformity that they can expect from the population and that they have to be careful about that. but they have thought, but they have decided that, tattoos and the Metoo movement are two things that they can't tolerate. Makes sense to me. It makes sense for the Metoo movement. I can see how that could be very dangerous for Chinese leadership. And, but tattoos, I'm slightly puzzled. I feel there was a grouchy Chinese bureaucrat somewhere saying, God, I can't stand all those tattoos, and everybody else agreed, and let's ban them, nuttiness. But I think that my point is that what the Chinese do and how they conduct their government is like a mathematical equation. And the point of the article by Dan Wang is that his argument is that if the U.S. is going to compete effectively with China on the world stage from now forward, what the U.S. needs is more government, not less. Because for example, he quotes American business people who work in China as saying, these 5-year plans are really handy. It makes it much easier for us to plan. We know that for the next 5 years, solar technology is going to be a big investment area for the Chinese, and we can plan accordingly. And we have a tremendous, so the argument goes, we have a disorganized, but in the US, the West has a disorganized but incredibly vibrant and innovative economy, and the Chinese have an efficient but copycat economy. But that's sort of where the argument is. And it's, I think probably in your lifetime, probably not in my lifetime, but in your lifetime, I think you'll probably...
Come on, Carmen, we're a couple of years apart. Come on, we're not even gonna. That's I'm. Okay.
You'll probably get a sense of of the denouement, right? How is it gonna work out? And the other interesting thing I found in the newsletter is that this author Dan Wang talked a lot about the differences in the different regions in China and how South China, that part of China around Hong Kong, but not Hong Kong anymore, but just those major cities down there, it's very vibrant. And the Shanghai area is incredibly vibrant. And the Beijing area is really problematic for any number of reasons. But all the major Western news services are anchored in Beijing. And so when we read about China here in the US, according to him, we're getting the Beijing flavored report on China, and we're ignoring his argument, the most dynamic and interesting parts of China. So I just thought that was useful to know. And I have a good friend who was a China expert at CIA, and so I often I'll share these letters with her, and she thinks they're very well observed. She doesn't agree completely, but she thinks they're very good.
That's really fascinating. From a utilitarian standpoint, if I were to, bring up the conversation of ethics or utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill and Bentham, it seems to be a prevailing way to, approach public policy. Let's see if we can make the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
Exactly.
I'm not saying it's the only way, but, it's a very, very good and well-established foundation for human happiness and well-being. Now, from a population standpoint, if I broke the world down into 3 quadrants, one of which being China, the next being India, and the third one being the U.S., Western, okay? Now, the U.S. population, I believe, ends up being, out of that trio, ends up being about... I think maybe I'm wrong. 1/6 or something,
I think 1/6 out of India. It might be 1/5 out of China. But yeah.
But anyway, so what we have,
we settle on 1/5 if you want.
I mean, and actually, so the ratio is. But what I'm saying in terms of like large populations, we have, cherished liberal democracies moving forward into the next 50 to 100 years. We have the authoritarian governments, which represent out of China, right? How do they move forward in the next 50 to 100 years? And then we have, say the Indian population. And I don't even know how to really typify that if we're comparing like cherished liberal democracy with, an authoritarian regime. India is something of its own. I mean, it's got democracy. There's, barter systems and hierarchies, and we don't have to really say it's as quite caste. There's, progressive aspects of their culture that, they're not, really antiquated back to the caste, although it is, it's still there. It's unique, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we have these major threads of philosophical understanding and like political direction. And there's a group called the Consilience Project that talks about the most resilient and probable in times of collapse, right? Okay, so this would be, in Carmen's words, is this worst case scenario? Probably. And there's a lot of suffering that could happen, and in a collapse scenario. And it was fairly, it was definitive, according to one of the leaders on the Consilience Project, that the authoritarian regime is the one that is the most resilient in that portion in a collapse scenario.
In a collapse scenario, yeah.
And so what we have is a growth scenario, which we being in the West have done exceedingly well, right? Mm-hmm. But in times of, like flat growth or decline or even collapse, well, where do we lean? And my fear is that if it gets unstable at home in the West, that more nationalistic interests start to emerge and protectionism starts to happen. We fall back onto, the superpower that the United States is. That seems to me actually to be one of the most likely outcomes of the way the way the world will unfold. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I know that my bias is that I'm optimistic by nature. And that, and I generally operate on the view that humans are basically good but feckless. So they they want to do good. They tell themselves they want to do good, but I think when they just make bad, ill-informed, stupid decisions all the time, right? So that's how I've navigated my years on the planet with that belief. And so I resist always the idea of collapse. But I will say that the COVID experience in the last 2 years and, some of the climate things that seem to be happening make me, I worry more now about the collapse scenario than I used to. And, there's a wonderful phrase attributed to Stalin and many other people that quantity has a quality all its own. Mm. And we have had in the West this marvelous self-monitoring, organically stable, without there being any man-built pillars, economic and social system that has hummed along. I go to my grocery store and I can be quite sure that most of everything that I want will be there. And there's nobody really planning any of this. But during COVID, there has been more disruption of that than normally. So I wonder, when I think about two things, when I think about our wonderful self-organizing, emergent economic and social systems in the West, I wonder whether or not they only operate well up to a certain point in size, or they only work well, that stock market term beta, volatility. So it's probably I am completely thinking out loud here. It's probably a combination. If I had to say, what are the limits to a self-organizing system, self-organizing effectively? It's probably a combination of size and beta volatility, because size means that the demand that it has to meet gets bigger and bigger. And so the margins get tighter and tighter as a result. And volatility, which is probably due more to exogenous factors like COVID, something comes at you that you had not anticipated, affects everything, right? Affects your margins, affects your total supply and all of that. So I do, I guess people have assumed, I certainly did, that self-organizing systems could self-organize no matter the circumstance. Just leave them alone and they'll figure it out, the market. Yeah. Is that true? I don't know. But then the other option is planned systems. And of course, China's trying to marry the two in some strange way. And I don't know if I mentioned this the last time, but, I always wondered, planned systems were just the demands upon planned systems were just too complex for any individual or group of individuals or primitive computer application to figure out. Too many variables. And so then I asked myself, could artificial intelligence someday actually make planned economies work? Can you imagine a cascading family of algorithms, humongous, right?
Yep.
That all work together in such a way that they could outperform a self-organizing system.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I always find that idea intriguing. Mm-hmm. It's not unlike the argument that I'm sure you've heard that the Federal Reserve, central banks in general, should not be people, but should be algorithms.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
And that you might have to have people involved every once in a while to reset the algorithm because of changing circumstances or priorities. But essentially, the algorithm would control the money supply and yada, and it wouldn't be so much humans. And I imagine that happens anyway now.
That scares the bejesus out of me. Now, you may or may not know, I host a weekly series with an economist.
Oh, okay.
And he's a contrarian economist. He's post-Keynesian. Uh-huh. He finished submitting something, I think it's on a revise and resubmit with the Royal Society. And this was to deconstruct and critique William Nordhaus's post-Keynesian, climate integration models, specifically DICE. And so I've had the pleasure of recording probably now, I think, about 28 episodes. I meet with Steve Keen on a weekly basis. Mm-hmm. And I very, very much lean towards his post-Keynesian approach. He's offering
How do you spell his last name?
Just K-E-E-N.
Okay, K-E-E-N. Okay, yeah.
And we do a series called COVID and Climate Correlations. I'm going to send you the link.
Great.
He's developed a software called Minsky after the famous Keynesian economist Minsky. And basically that middleman that you're talking about with that basically the emergence of the finance sector, I would say. I already feel myself not explaining this properly.
Right.
But there's the neoclassical economists really gravitate towards a state of homogeneity, equilibrium. And one of his main points is that it's not an equilibrium system. And so what's projected from DICE in terms of GDP drop over, say, for example, the AMOC crashed, there's such a small drop in the GDP, it's almost ridiculous. So his push is actually to get the field of economists, which are essentially social scientists, out of the policymaking, because they are actually they're so dangerous to the system. Okay, right, and so that's his perspective, and so I come at a real different perspective when it comes to that, and actually I'm excited that it came up in conversation because I think it's from his mathematical models, he's actually trying to put something forward that proves in a mathematical foundation, that not only is the neoclassical models incorrect, but also what he's trying to put forward is basically there's a whole conversation about how money's generated, what it's for, and a whole bunch of things, right? So I mean that would be a whole episode to itself. Please do look at that. I will research that a little bit. And then I've kind of lost my direction here. I think.
I don't know. I mean, our hour is almost over, so I don't know that we have time to pick up another random thread and chew on it.
Yeah, we didn't get to talk about the overarching God hypothesis. I think we'll leave that to episode 3.
Okay.
But if we can summarize anything in terms of political powers collapse, and it might just be an associative exercise, what kind of comes to mind when you're talking about mental health, well-being, anti-fragility? Is there some piece of wisdom that you can give people to try and stay sane in this ever increasing
You know what I think about it, this is another one of my rules of life. So, humans are basically good but feckless. You can't count on them to do the right or the good or the correct thing, the productive thing. And another rule is I'm influenced by the great philosopher Daffy Duck.
Okay,
Actually, he's more a model of what not to do. If you think about the Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny cartoons, they're often together, and they often encounter, therefore, the same problem. Daffy Duck immediately panics. He just, he starts bouncing in the air, and he's just loses it no matter what's happening. This never happens to Bugs Bunny, right? Bugs is like chews on his carrot and literally pulls a rabbit out of his hat at some point. And so I think and I think actually this is perhaps historically provable. I think that panic is not usually a good response, at least to the kind of social things that we're talking about. And as a teaser, I will tell you that, that's one of my concerns about climate change, is that I just don't think we know enough about how these systems work to, with any confidence, out of some sense of panic, create some kind of policy intervention that, for all we know, will make it worse, right? So, or not make it better. So my advice is be Bugs Bunny, not Daffy Duck. Don't panic. Because at a minimum, and they say that about playing competitive sports as well. It's another way of saying stay within yourself, right? Don't overextend. Just concentrate on doing what you do well. And it's completely conceivable that our problems will overwhelm us. Yeah, I can see that happening, but I think we'll make that happen faster if we're Daffy Ducks than if we're Bugs Bunnies.
Well said. Well said. Okay. Well, thanks again for joining us this episode. And next month, we're going to record another. And until then.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. I appreciate it.
I don't really understand why you would enjoy this conversation, but I enjoy it. So that's good for me.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, yeah, we're good. I mean.
All right.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thanks, Carmen.
Bye.
Bye.